Hi there, and thanks for joining me for this year's Houston Habitat for Humanity virtual Building a Dream Luncheon. I'm your host, Owen Conflenti from KPRC Channel 2. Today, this special event is being streamed from Houston Habitat for Humanity's warehouse, where around me are all the materials needed to build and repair affordable homes for Houstonians. Now, while we can't be together this year, we still have a great lineup ahead. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to Reverend Harvey Clemens Jr. from Pleasant Hill Baptist Church to begin with a prayer.
Thanks, Owen. You're invited to join me as we go to our Creator and ask for His blessings. Most gracious and holy God, we come to you with grateful hearts. We come to you, God, expressing our gratitude for the many donors, volunteers, the staff who helped to bring, God, the dream of being a homeowner from the theoretical to the experiential. We thank you, Father, for a reasonable portion of health and strength. We thank you, God, for being citizens of this great nation. It is our hope and our prayer, God, that you would bless the many families who are sick and suffering from this pandemic, that you would bless this nation, this organization, and we, your people. Bless us and keep us. Our prayer, God, is that you would hide us under the shadow of your wings until these calamities shall pass. Hold us, if you will. Thank you. Let the words of our mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. This is our prayer, each in our own way, but many of us in the name of Jesus the Christ. Amen.
Well, thank you, Reverend Clemens, for those inspiring words. Now, if you haven't had the opportunity to meet Houston Habitat Executive Director Allison Haye, you will quickly learn she is a passionate leader who is enthusiastic about the organization's mission. Let's hear a few words from her.
I'd like to welcome you to our 2020 virtual luncheon. So when I say 2020, did you wince? It's been quite a year, but I'm proud to say that Houston Habitat has risen to the challenge. I remember back in the day, I was so excited for Luncheon Day. I'd be able to dress up, and I'd be able to drive to the luncheon, and I'd be able to hug and shake hands with our friends that are supporters of Houston Habitat. And then we would sit down and have a meal, and then we'd be able to bring together our hearts and our minds to honor people who support Houston Habitat and our mission. So today, we're going to bring our hearts and minds together. We're going to honor the people that support Houston Habitat, and we're going to listen to wise persons speak to us about housing and building communities. As our world changed last spring, Houston Habitat responded. We reached out to check on our families, our homeowners, our partner families, our volunteers, and our families within the Habitat community. We transformed our processes to make sure we could continue to serve our homeowners and partner families. Masked up, hands washed, socially distant. Incorporated more technology to have virtual home dedications, developed an online home ownership program application, invested in new software to better serve the families in our programs, developed a streamlining process through our new project management system. And boy, have we missed our volunteers. During this time, when we couldn't have volunteers on the build site, we developed a new core volunteer program. This will add to our already robust volunteer experience. Dedicated volunteers will be able to teach others how to do core construction skills that will help us build a better home. Having a decent, safe home has been at the forefront of this pandemic. We've seen the need for families to have a place to work, a place to quarantine, and a place to socially distance. It is so hard for families to stay home and stay safe when they don't have a home that is safe. Affordable housing that is safe and secure is needed more now than ever. We've seen a rise in evictions and foreclosures as the economic process of the crisis is now coming to bear. The tragic loss of Black lives have shed a light on inequities among our communities, especially in the housing world. It is hard to have racial equity when you don't have housing equity. We believe that we still must continue to support equitable housing solutions for Black Americans. Houston Habitat will carry on, revitalizing, building, renovating, and moving new families into their homes. I want to thank you today for your time, because time is precious right now. I hope you enjoyed the speaker today and the stories that we share. Please donate to Houston Habitat. The link is below the event. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. It's so great to see that the awesome work of the organization has been able to continue through the pandemic, and that includes building homes. You know, for the past 7 years, I've been proud to work with Houston Habitat for Humanity, building homes. Hammering is a ton of fun, let me tell you. But the best part for me is the families, meeting the families and getting to know them. And I'd like you to have the opportunity to meet a Habitat family right now.
I've lived in my Houston Habitat home for a little over 4 years. It's nothing like stability and having your own home. I love it. Going through the program at Houston Habitat, it was fun. It was kind of challenging at first because of the sweat equity hours that we had to do. It was a lot, but after a while, we got the hang of it. My home was the women's bill. The majority of the people that volunteered on my home were ladies. And they came from church groups, some were businesses. Once we put the frame up, they would write biblical scriptures and encouraging words on the frame of my house. That was really touching. When I first became a homeowner, the immediate change was to have my own space. I didn't have anyone living over me or under me. I was able to make changes to my home to fit my taste. I have 2 daughters, and I also have a granddaughter. One of my daughters, she did become a Habitat homeowner recently. I'm just grateful that she was able to participate in the home buying experience. I'm helping her now decorate her home, so I'm very proud of her. Favorite part of my home, I really like having my own yard and plant flowers, and I do my own lawn. That's therapeutic for me. I would tell people that are considering the Habitat program, go for it, because that's the best thing, to have your own.
It's wonderful to see the great work of Houston Habitat for Humanity extends beyond the rest of the family. Thank you. Each year, Houston Habitat for Humanity honors an individual who shows unwavering determination to support the Houston community, quite like the founder of Houston Habitat for Humanity, Carl Umland. So this year, we'd like to honor Stephen Fairfield.
I grew up in the Memorial Villages. My father was a builder and developer. I worked summers for him, and then joining him after college, first leasing office space and then putting developments together. By the time I was 10, I had lived in 10 different homes. When I was 18, a tornado rendered me homeless. I learned through losing a home like that you miss the things that connect you with the people you love. I came to know Christ through the Navigators. I wanted to find a way to follow him through my work.
Steve was working for the city of Houston. Myself and some citizens knew that we needed to do something to revitalize the Fifth Ward community, and we needed someone to be the executive director. He had the skill set, the competency, but more importantly, he was daring. And finally, he had an abiding love for our Creator.
When Habitat moved on to the second ward, Harvey, Carl, and other community leaders wanted to see things continue in Fifth Ward. So Carl and Harvey came to me and asked for ideas. Carl was an inspiration to me and a mentor. He was a humane, no-nonsense guy who got things done, and I loved him.
We don't just build houses, we build lives. You have to believe in this work and you have to have a passion for it, and Steve had that.
I became convinced that I needed to be a part of the community I was serving. So I moved into an old warehouse in the oldest part of the neighborhood on Walnut Street. We raised 3 daughters there and had a wonderful community with our neighbors.
Stephen is what I consider a servant leader. He goes about what he does very quietly, but in a very big way.
I first got to know Stephen when I came on as CEO of the Women's Home. Our mission is to build communities that strengthen women and support families. This is the place where they can come and reclaim their lives. The Dallenberg Pieper Family Place is the living embodiment of our mission. Stephen actually helped us design the concept, build the funding sources, and really bring it to fruition. This building wouldn't exist but for Stephen.
In addition to helping folks get to their goal of home ownership, Steve's also there to help the families that we all serve when they run into a hard time. If someone is in trouble, we can pick up the phone and we can call Steve.
We can't give families a dream, but we walk alongside them to help them achieve their dream. At Covenant Community Capital, last year we put 89 families earning an average of $24,000 into their first home. We also recently completed Harvey home repairs on 119 homes of low-income rural homeowners. And we are nearing completion on a clinic near the medical center.
Stephen is absolutely deserving of this honor. He is a person of perseverance and determination. He has always been an advocate through his action and leadership. He is very much like Carl Umland in that way.
Each year, we have the pleasure of honoring an individual that demonstrates the same passion and tenacity as our founder, Carl Umland. Mr. Stephen Fairfield demonstrates all of those qualities and more. Stephen's passion in educating others about affordable housing and its issues has made an impact on Houston for many years. He is a mentor and an advocate and willingly shares his expertise with all that will listen. I met Stephen many years ago, and he has always been able to support and contribute for my education and how to build Houston and our affordable housing initiatives. He's passionate about his work, he's passionate about teaching others, and he is willing to help all who ask. I am so proud to be able to work alongside Stephen as we address affordable housing issues in the city of Houston. And it is my honor to present Stephen Fairfield with the Carl Umland Award.
There are many advocates for affordable and decent housing in Houston, and we are so grateful to have Stephen Fairfield as one of them. Another big advocate for the great work of Houston Habitat for Humanity is General Counsel Toni Jackson, and she's here today to introduce us to our keynote speaker.
Houston Habitat, homeowners, friends, and guests. I am so excited to be here with you today to introduce our guest speaker, Richard Rothstein. Richard and I became friends a few years ago when I had the pleasure of inviting him to serve on a panel with me to discuss the recent Baltimore and Ferguson riots. Our conversation was to discuss the relationship of race and housing and how we had gotten to that place. Since that time, Richard and I have become dear friends and had lots of conversations about that subject. Richard has since explored the connection of race and housing, but more importantly, the systemic policies that have been provided by the government that has gotten us to this place. He has written a book called The Color of Law, which is a must-read. And if you haven't already read it, you're going to get an opportunity to read it after today's luncheon. Richard is one of the forefront thinkers in this area, and he delves into the issues of housing, how we have been segregated, and how we can address some of this neighborhood segregation to allow people to have choice. I'm really excited that you're going to have a chance to listen to Richard today, and I know that you're going to enjoy him.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks all of you for inviting me to have this conversation with you today. Let me begin by saying that in the 20th century, as you know, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in colleges and universities, and then in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown decision gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a movement of civil rights activism. People engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. Some people lost their lives in that struggle. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful both to blacks and whites, it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. We succeeded in abolishing segregation in interstate transportation, in public accommodations, in lunch counters and swimming pools and water fountains, employment. In 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But yet, at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement ended, left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all black or mostly black. How could it be? We came to understand that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. And yet we left untouched the biggest segregation of all. Well, partly it's because it's hard to redress residential segregation. We don't like the fact that we live in an apartheid society. Many of us think it's too bad, but it's a very hard thing to undo, so we'd rather find an excuse not to do it. And the excuse we've come up with goes something like this. It's a rationalization. We tell ourselves that the segregation of schools and colleges and lunch counters and buses, the things that we addressed in the 20th century, those were all done by government. They were civil rights violations. If the federal government was requiring segregation, that was a Fifth Amendment violation. We have an obligation as American citizens to remedy that kind of constitutional violation. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a 14th Amendment violation. We also have a responsibility to remedy those civil rights violations. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, is something entirely different. That wasn't done by government, we said. That wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. Residential segregation just sort of happened by accident, happened naturally. Oh, private landlords or homeowners wouldn't sell or rent to an African-American family in a white neighborhood. Or maybe actors in the private economy, businesses, banks, real estate agents, discriminated in how they carried out their work. Or maybe it's because people just like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all economic. African Americans on average have lower incomes than whites, and many of them cannot afford to move to predominantly white neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, but personal, non-governmental, private sector actions is what created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. We've given a name to this rationalization. It's one that we all use, blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners. We say we've got de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact, not in law. Well, I spent much of my career studying education policy. In the 1990s and 2000s, I was writing much of my work was writing about what I thought was the misguided education policy that we're following in this country. That policy said that we have a very serious problem of an achievement gap between Black and white children. And the reason we have that gap is because teachers of Black children are bigoted and just don't try very hard. And the way to close the achievement gap, this policy said, is by simply making teachers work harder. And we passed a law to that effect. In 2001, we passed a No Child Left Behind Act, which required that children be tested every year and hold teachers accountable for those test scores and schools accountable for those test scores. And if we do, the theory was the achievement gap would very shortly disappear. It was a ludicrous theory. Of course, there are some bigoted teachers, but that's not the main reason for the achievement gap. And in article after article, I tried to explain that the reason we have an achievement gap is primarily because of the social and economic disadvantages that so many African-American children come to school with. I remember writing a one column about asthma. As you may know, African-American children in low-income neighborhoods have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children, 4 times the rate. They have asthma at 4 times the rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, more empty lots kicking up dust. And I tried to explain in this column that if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than another child who doesn't have asthma, not necessarily the case in all cases, but more likely to be up at night wheezing, coming to school drowsy the next day, maybe sleepless. And if you have 2 groups of children, identical in every respect, same racial breakdown, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group's going to have lower average achievement because it's going to be less wide awake in school. It won't make a big difference, but it'll make some. But then when you think of all the other conditions that also have an impact, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity, and you begin to add up the effects of all of these, pretty much you've explained the achievement gap. Well, I soon realized that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. What happens if you have a school where every child has one or more of these conditions? How could such a school ever be expected to have the same achievement as a school where children come to school healthy and well-rested and well-nourished and in secure homes? Of course, you can't have that expectation no matter how many laws you write saying it's true. Well, I began to realize that after a while, it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness, but if every school has that, the reason is that those schools are segregated. That's the term we use for it, because they're located in neighborhoods that are segregated. Schools today are more segregated than they have been at any time in the last 45 years in this country because of neighborhood segregation. So I began to think of neighborhood segregation as an educational problem. That's how I came to this work. I wasn't initially interested particularly in housing issues. I was interested in educational issues. And I thought of neighborhood segregation as an educational policy problem. Well, this is what I was thinking about. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision in which 2 school districts were reviewed, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of those districts had a choice plan, an attempt to minimize segregation. They gave parents the choice of which school their child would attend in the district. But if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, it wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who wouldn't do so. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school and one place left in that school, and both a Black and a white child applied for that last place, the Black child would be given some preference, help to desegregate the school. It was a trivial program. You don't have one place left in the school very often, and both a Black and a white child are the last to apply for it. But the Supreme Court denounced this program, said you couldn't do such a thing. The decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He explained that the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. It's true. But he said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. I thought that was a wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. And then he said that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated de facto for the reasons I described before: private bigotry, actions of private actors, in the economy, self-choice, income differences. And he said, if you have de facto segregation, something that wasn't created by government, not a Fifth Amendment violation, not a 14th Amendment violation, not a civil rights violation. If you have de facto segregation that government didn't create, government must be prohibited from doing anything explicit to fix it. Well, I thought about this decision a bit, and I remembered reading about something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the two cities involved in the decision. In Louisville, Kentucky, some years before, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home of all white homes, a suburb, called Shively. This Shively homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child. He wanted to bring up his family in a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in the suburb of Shively bought a second home there, resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob of white neighbors surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop them. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop them. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the courts, the entire criminal justice system is being used to maintain racial boundaries in Louisville, Kentucky. And when I began to look into it further, I found that this wasn't an isolated incident. There were hundreds and hundreds of cases in cities all across the country, not just in border states or the South, like Kentucky or Texas, but there too, but in New York and Chicago and Detroit and Kansas City and Los Angeles and San Francisco, of police-protected, sometimes even police-led and organized mob violence against African Americans who had legitimately moved into or rented in previously all-white neighborhoods. Every one of these, where the police was either protecting or instigating or leading violence to drive African Americans out of their homes, was a civil rights violation, 14th Amendment violation. We have an obligation to remedy each one of them, and we've never done so. Well, I began to look into it a bit further, and I found it wasn't just state-sponsored violence that created the segregation that we know today, but there were hundreds of cases of other federal, state, and local policies that were racially explicit, that were designed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. The system was so pervasive of federal, state, and local policies, racially explicit to enforce segregation, that the notion of de facto segregation becomes utter nonsense. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. It's, as I say, a term we all use. It has no basis in truth or reality. The segregation that we have in this country today was created, sustained, and reinforced by government policy in violation of the Constitution. Residential segregation is unconstitutional as a segregation of water fountains or buses or schools or colleges. Well, let me spend a few minutes describing the chief policy that the federal government followed. There were many, many others, and others followed by state and local governments as well. I won't have time to go into but I'll describe one policy the federal government followed. In the post-World War II period, the federal government embarked on a program to relocate the entire white working class population out of urban apartments where they were renting into single family homes in all white suburbs that surrounded the cities where they lived. It was a racially explicit program. We were not a suburban country at that time. The only people living in suburbs were affluent families. There were no working class or middle class families living in suburbs, mostly because we were a manufacturing economy. And factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals, in order to get their parts or ship their final products. And so It was commonplace for whites as well as African Americans to be living in urban areas, frequently integrated areas, because they had to be able to walk to work or maybe take short streetcar rides. They didn't have cars to drive in from the suburbs. So the federal government embarked on a program to move the white working class population out of these cities. The highways were beginning to be built. Working class families began to have more automobiles. So it was possible for whites to live in suburban communities. The federal government embarked on this program on a racially explicit basis to move white families out of urban areas into suburbs and prohibit African Americans from doing the same, creating a segregation that had never previously existed. These suburbs exist as kind of a white noose around every metropolitan area in the country. The most famous of these suburbs is Levittown, east of New York City. Perhaps you've heard of it. 17,000 homes in one place. But there were suburbs like this built in every community in Houston, elsewhere in Texas, in Atlanta, in New York, in Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, San Francisco, everywhere. These suburban communities were built for whites only at the behest of the Federal Housing and Veterans Administration. The builder of Levittown, those 17,000 homes in one place east of New York City, could never have assembled the capital to build this project, to buy the land, to build the houses on his own. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him that money. They thought that the whole idea of suburbanization was an idea that made no sense. The only way that Levitt, the builder, could get the capital to buy the land and build this project was by going to the Federal Housing and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development, the materials he was going to use, the layout of the streets, the architectural design of the houses, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required Levitt and all of these other builders, in many cases everywhere in the country, to put a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was an explicit racial policy. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was written out in a federal policy manual called the Underwriting Manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to examine the applications of builders, developers who wanted federal bank guarantees for their suburban projects. The manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that was going to sell to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee an all-white development if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. On this basis, as I say, a white noose was created around every metropolitan area in this country. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. Segregation is a project of the federal government. Well, the returning war veterans, mostly that's who they were, who bought those homes in these federally subsidized and required segregated communities. They bought them inexpensively. The homes were small, modest working class homes, 750 square feet typically for the home. They sold at the time for about $8,000, and in today's money, that's about $100,000. The white families who bought those homes for $100,000, and if they were returning war veterans, they had no down payment required, gained over the next few generations wealth from the ownership of those homes. Most Americans who have any wealth get it from the equity they have in their homes if their homes happen to appreciate in value. And these suburban homes did appreciate in value. They no longer sell for $100,000. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. The white families, I say, gained equity from wealth from this appreciation. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to take care of perhaps temporary emergencies, maybe unemployment. If you're unemployed, if you lose a job and you have wealth, you can weather that period until you find a new job. If you lose a job and you don't have wealth, you're permanently pushed further down the economic scale in a more helpless position. They used it, the white families used this wealth to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth for their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this wealth generating exercise. They were not permitted to buy these suburban homes by federal policy. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and that has never been remedied. And we as American citizens have an obligation to remedy. Well, there were many, many other federal, state, and local policies that were implemented to impose segregation. The segregation that was created by this wealth gap, for example, and reinforced by the wealth gap, produces the achievement gap in schools that I described earlier. It produces health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, less access to grocery stores that sell fresh food, less healthy air. The wealth gap and the segregation that it helped create predicts the mass incarceration that we know today and police abuse of African Americans, particularly young African American men. I'm not suggesting that police wouldn't discriminate if it weren't for segregation, but it would be much, much more difficult for them to do it to the extent that they do today when we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without jobs or access to transportation to get to good jobs, without access to schools with high achievement. It's inevitable that the police will engage in confrontations with them, that the police will behave towards them like an occupying force whose role it is to suppress their initiative. That's the way colonial forces operate in other countries of the world, whether in India or the Congo or elsewhere. And so it's not surprising that when we create an apartheid system and concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods, that police will behave the same there as they do in similar situations elsewhere. And the segregation that we've created has produced something else that is very, very frightening and dangerous. And that is the political polarization that we have in this country today, which is not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that's necessary to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to understand each other, no ability to empathize with each other, no possibility of developing that common national identity that a democracy requires? Well, those are some of the consequences of the segregation that we created. Our government acting on our behalves, and that we, American citizens, have an obligation to remedy. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. There's no mystery about them. Think tanks, journalists, housing experts write about these policies all the time. What's missing is not more policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that, in the words of the late John Lewis, that we've quoted so much lately, that would make good trouble to make the perpetuation of segregation uncomfortable enough that people are motivated to want to do something about it. With that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Richard Rothstein's certainly given us a lot to think about today, with health and equity on the minds of so many. What he had to say was really timely. Housing indeed impacts everyone's life. Now, prior to today's event, a lot of you received a piece of wood like this. Oftentimes on a habitat build site, workers will write messages on the studs of the walls that frame the home. I'd like to invite you to do the same. That piece of wood will be collected and used in future Houston Habitat builds. I wrote one today. I wrote simply, love. Just think, These messages will live in future homes for families for years to come. Now let's meet another Houston Habitat homeowner, Annie, and let's hear about her journey.
My journey started with living in a home in Fifth Ward, and I had ceilings falling in on me. I would come home tired from work and step onto the carpet and the floor would be soaking wet. I've lived through the summer without air conditioning. I've lived through the winter without heat. I just couldn't take it anymore. My involvement with Houston Habitat for Humanity has been the best journey of my life. I went through the program in 4 months instead of 6 because I was determined. I want to show my children, my grandchildren, now I have great-grandchildren, you can't ever let your dream die. I became a homeowner at age 61 years old. I sat in there and signed those papers and got my keys and moved the same day. September 29th, 2020 will be 5 years. I'm living my best life now because I'm a Houston Habitat for Humanity homeowner. And when I turn that key and walk in, it's mine. I don't have to worry about a ceiling falling on my head. I don't have to worry about the plumbing. I don't have to worry that when I go to wash my dishes that the faucet is going to come off in my hand. Family is everything to me. After I bought my home, my daughter bought a home the following year. And now my grandchildren are taking steps to purchase homes. They want homes for their children. So I see that it has become a domino effect, which is what I wanted, and I want it to continue. If you're able, give to Houston Habitat for Humanity. The workers, the volunteers, the staff, I love them. They've become part of my family. Give dollars if you have them. Give time. Give talent. Give your resources. Give materials. Because when you give, that's part of your legacy. I love my community. First thing in the morning when I get up, sometime you'll see me and I'll walk up and down the street. Or I'll just come out and I'll look around and I'll say, this is my neighborhood. It's the best dream. It's the best dream in the world.
Thank you, Annie, for sharing your story. And as Annie mentioned, if you can, please make a gift. There's a link in the event description, or you can go to houstonhabitat.org/buildingadream. From everyone here at Houston Habitat for Humanity, our speakers, our families, thank you for tuning in today and being part of our 2020 virtual Building a Dream Luncheon. We'd also like to thank our co-chairs for today, Stephen Goldberg and Sonia Trouillet. But let's not forget, we can't do any of this great work without our sponsors. And today, we'd like to recognize you as well. Next year, hopefully, the luncheon will be in person. It's scheduled for October 19th, 2021. So once again, thank you, and we can't wait to see you next year.